Hi there, I'm Kim Vanel. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera. Your look at the world of business and economics. This week, nationalism, diplomacy and the rights to make vaccines. Is it time for rich nations and drug makers to give developing countries the technology to speed up the rollout of vaccines? The road to a more healthy and productive country could be through improving mental well-being. We find out why governments are not spending enough on mental health. And despite the pandemic, the Islamic finance industry grows at double-digit rates. So what's behind the rise? And does the practice live up to actual Islamic principles? With the European Union in the midst of a third wave of the COVID pandemic, Brussels has been threatening to block the export of vaccines, ratcheting up the spectre of vaccine nationalism. It isn't alone. The United States has refused to release 30 million unused doses of the AstraZeneca vaccine to aid the woeful rollout in Europe. And even India, with one of the most advanced vaccine production facilities, is holding back supplies to vaccinate its 1 billion-plus population. Against this background, South Africa and India turned to the World Trade Organization to ask vaccine makers to give up their intellectual property rights so more vaccines can be produced locally. It's a proposal that Washington, London and Brussels have roundly rejected. The WTO believes the global economy would lose $9 trillion in potential output if poor countries were unable to get their populations vaccinated quickly. Vaccination is crucial to get the 250 million people who lost their jobs during the pandemic back into work. And without vaccinations, there could be more strains and variants, so it would make sense to share the underlying technology. Yet with all the posturing and promises of the Quad, that is Australia, India, Japan and the United States, to deliver 1 billion doses to Asia, that won't happen until the end of 2022. So governments are keen to get their hands on supplies from other sources. But Washington, under President Trump, was putting pressure on countries not to take vaccines from Russia. The Sputnik jab presents an opportunity for the Kremlin, which is taking full advantage of vaccine diplomacy to grow its influence in Latin America. Teresa Bo reports from Buenos Aires.
A plane from Argentina's national airline carrying thousands of doses of Russia's Sputnik V vaccine. The event was shown on most major television networks in the country.
We have signed a contract with the Russian Federation. What does that contract say? What that contract says is that we will be able to have enough doses to vaccinate 10 million Argentinians between January and February.
Even though that deadline has passed and 10 million doses are yet to arrive in Argentina, Russia has become a crucial vaccine supplier for Latin America. Last year, as developed nations closed deals with large laboratories for vaccines, countries in the region turned to Russia through fear of being left behind.
Argentina was one of the first countries in the region to send a special delegation to Moscow. It later translated thousands of documents related to the vaccine into Spanish in order to get the vaccine approved as soon as possible. It later on shared that information with other countries in Latin America like Mexico and Bolivia. At the beginning, people here in Argentina looked at the Sputnik V vaccine with doubt. Now they're waiting in line to get inoculated.
Bolivia was hard hit by the pandemic. Almost 12,000 people lost their lives in what is considered one of the region's poorest countries. Authorities in the country say Russia's Sputnik V vaccine was the only resource available.
Availability in the world, as we know, is very, very low. Most of the companies are breaching the contracts. They cannot even deliver what they have promised. So it would be very unlikely that Bolivia will be able to access vaccine in the first half of this year. Thanks to the intervention of our own president, who has contacted the president of Russia by phone, this contract was achieved.
Russia was the first country to register a COVID vaccine last year. And since then, Sputnik V has become a diplomatic resource between Moscow and Latin America. Analysts here say it's part of a plan.
The relationship with Russia has to do with an objective of Russia's foreign ministry, with Putin, of projecting his presence in the region, occupying areas where the United States is missing, but also as a way to compensate the presence of the US at the border with Russia in Ukraine, the Western presence in a way. It means being in the United States' backyard. There's also the economic aspect.
Local reports indicate Moscow is already eyeing future contracts in Argentina that include a nuclear power plant and a train in Vaca Muerta, an area that's believed to have some of the largest reserves of shale oil and gas in the world. But for now, there's a pandemic, and for many countries in the region, the Sputnik V is the only chance to prevent further loss of life.
So what are other nations doing to get their hands on vaccines? Well, in Pakistan, they're allowing private institutions to buy and sell vaccines to those that can afford it. I'm delighted to say that Dr Omar Chughtai, Director of Operations at Chughtai Laboratories in Lahore, is with me now. Thank you so much for joining us. So explain this to me. Pakistan needs the World Health Organization's help in order to vaccinate its population. It's using the COVAX scheme, but you're able to buy and sell these vaccines privately. How does that work?
Well, to be clear, the vast majority of people getting vaccinated in Pakistan are going to be vaccinated through the government-led rollout, which is going to be supplied by the COVAX facility and through direct procurement by the government from various vaccine-producing nations such as China. In that context, in Pakistan, a significant chunk of healthcare is delivered by the private sector. And the government has been pragmatic about tackling the COVID crisis all along. And they have taken the private sector as a part of the solution, whether it was ramping up testing capacity last year and whether it is ramping up the vaccine rollout this year. So in that context, the government allowed private sector companies to import the vaccine to Pakistan. Now, to be clear, the companies that are importing the vaccine to Pakistan are the ones that have been nominated by the various manufacturers of the vaccine that have the emergency use authorization in Pakistan. So the importers will bring the vaccine to Pakistan, but they can only sell it to vaccination centers such as ours and various other hospitals, which are plugged into the national database so that all people who get vaccinated, whether they're getting their vaccine at the public sector facility or at a private sector facility, their data gets accumulated in the National Immunization Management System.
Okay, I understand that. And I also understand it's a very big job. I mean, what's the population? 220 million people in Pakistan. I understand it's a big task. But critics say that by allowing people to pay for their vaccines, you're creating a system that is inherently unequal.
I agree that no solution in this crisis is perfect. But the proponents of this system say that if there are people who can pay for the vaccine, and it's not just people who can pay for the vaccine, but also people who can pay for the vaccine for other people. For instance, charitable organizations, associations of expat Pakistanis have been in contact with us where they want to subsidize or pay for vaccines for hundreds of thousands of people. This allows them to join the fray and help them be a part of the solution. And the government rollout is progressing smoothly at a certain pace, and the government is going in a stepwise manner. They vaccinated healthcare workers first, then they are now vaccinating senior citizens above 60 years of age. But there are people who have underlying medical conditions, or there are people who have other loved ones at home who have underlying medical conditions, and they want to get vaccinated, even if they have to pay for it, because it's a life-changing, life-altering, life-saving intervention in many cases. And if there are ways that the vaccine can be made available, which also in turn eases the burden on the public program, then I think it can be a part of the solution.
So you have the permission to buy the Sputnik vaccine. I believe that Russia is selling that vaccine for about $10 for 2 doses. So what are you going to charge for it? What's the markup?
So I want to be very clear. We are not importing any vaccine directly. We are not, even if we wanted to, we could not import any vaccine directly. The government has recognized the company nominated importers for Pakistan for the various vaccines. The company that is importing the Sputnik vaccine is currently in negotiations with the government of Pakistan regarding pricing in Pakistan. We are ready as a vaccination center. We are enrolled with the National Command Operations Center and with the National Immunization Database, so that we are ready to go as soon as that sorted. Whatever price is decided by the government and the vaccine importing company, we will make the vaccine available at that same price.
Okay. Does Pakistan have the ability to manufacture vaccines?
I think a lot has changed in the last 1 year. 1 year ago, Pakistan didn't have the capacity to make even PPE to fulfill its own needs. But 6 months later, Pakistan was exporting personal protective equipment. Similarly, there are several large pharmaceutical companies in Pakistan, and for that matter, the NIH, the National Institute of Health, which has been at the forefront of this fight, has been very involved in developing their own production capacity. I hear that they're in talks with a couple of Chinese companies to try and import concentrated vaccine and then at least start packaging it in Pakistan to ease the burden, and then develop capacity to manufacture it in Pakistan down the road. Because this, first of all, the COVID vaccine demand is not going away in the next couple of months. Also, because we need to be prepared for the next pandemic. So I think the government and the private sector pharmaceutical players are getting ready to be ready for the next wave. As of now, we are dependent on imports, but hopefully that will not be the case in a few months or at least in a couple of years.
Mm-hmm. As we've been saying earlier on in the show, several nations have gone to the World Trade Organization wanting to get access to the intellectual property in order to make these vaccines within their own countries. Do you think that would help Pakistan's situation?
Absolutely, and I think anytime you can have intellectual property available for other players to partner up and start manufacturing, that will definitely ease the transition from manufacturing other medicine to manufacturing the vaccine. We are all in it together. The WHO keeps saying again and again that no one is safe until everybody is safe. And that is very true. We have seen right now Pakistan is in the middle of a third wave. And this is, by all accounts, this is primarily the variant that started in South Africa and also the variant from the UK. And so the virus will keep mutating unless it mutates away, which is a possibility, a small possibility, but we have to get better at fighting it. And the principal intervention to fight it is to get as many people vaccinated as quickly as possible.
All right, even if they do have to or want to pay for it. Hey, thank you so much for your time, Dr. Omar Chughtai, there, Director of Operations at Chughtai Laboratories.
Thank you.
Now, what makes us happy? A job, perhaps, money and family. And what happens when we lose a job and we can't see our families, like many of us are experiencing right now to varying degrees due to the pandemic? Missing out on what made us happy has led to a rise in depression. Mental health issues have hit the young and women the hardest, but they're not just the preserve of rich nations. Globally, almost 1 billion people suffer with a mental health disorder, and more than 75% of people in low-income countries don't receive treatment. That's according to the World Health Organization. Countries spend on average only 2% of their health budgets on mental health. And that's despite the fact that for every $1 invested in treatment for common mental health disorders such as depression and anxiety, there's a return of $5 in improved health and productivity. Some of the numbers around suicides and substance abuse are just plainly alarming. So is mental well-being one of the most neglected aspects of healthcare? Well, my next guest may have the answer. Dr. Alison Schafer is the Program Manager for the World Health Organization's Initiative for Mental Health. She joins us via Skype from Erbil in Iraq. Thank you for your time. So why is mental health so neglected?
Gee, mental health has been neglected for decades, and there's probably a multitude of reasons. We know that mental health carries a lot of stigma and discrimination around it, and people often don't see mental health as true suffering as a health condition. So a lot of people might actually prefer to fund services that they might consider life-saving, but we're starting to get a picture now that mental health is also part of overall health. It's a fundamental part of health and can be as life-saving as other health interventions.
Even just looking at the numbers, for every $1 spent on mental health, you get a $5 return on productivity. I mean, that must be the easiest sell for governments who are concerned with the bottom line.
Sure. The returns on investment are substantial, and, those statistics are actually based on just addressing the issues of depression and anxiety, let alone the multitude of other mental health conditions that affect people. And it seems to be a growing area of interest, particularly following COVID. And we have seen slow, very, very slow increases in investment in mental health, but it still remains one of the most underfunded areas of all health in the world.
GDP, gross domestic product, is obviously one of the measures that governments base their success, their trajectory on. But perhaps are we missing something substantial here? Could we be measuring, how well a nation is doing by its happiness, by some sort of index to measure how happy we are as a population?
Sure, certainly that's a road that some countries are travelling. I can think of New Zealand as one example. But perhaps I wonder if another measure might actually be the productivity that we are losing because of untreated mental health conditions. So when we talk about that potential return on investment, we say that, for every $1 spent on treating depression and anxiety and other disorders, a $5 return on investment could actually be made through governments because people will be more productive. Children and adolescents will stay in school longer. And a lot more can actually go towards a national GDP if their population are healthy, and that includes their fundamental mental health.
It was interesting you mentioned New Zealand there, and I guess that's an example of how it's not a straight line, because even though they do care about how happy people are, New Zealand still has one of the highest, or traditionally one of the highest, youth suicide rates in the world. Which brings me on to my next point, the pandemic and mental health. We've been so concerned with the economic impact of not having production lines, manufacturing up and running, but there's an economic cost too, isn't there, to people's well-being, mental well-being suffering?
For sure, definitely. We did a survey recently that actually revealed some 93% of countries have actually halted or had adverse impacts on their mental health services. So this means not only the people who had conditions before the pandemic, there will even be more people that are experiencing those conditions, including adolescents, as a consequence of lockdowns and other economic hardships. So this is something that we especially need to start looking at and addressing further. And while countries like New Zealand are doing well in some respects, they still have a long way to go. And this is where we say all countries are still developing when it comes to mental health. But the disparity is particularly challenging for low resource countries with low GDP and low health budgets, where even less than 2% of a health budget can actually be spent on mental health services. So there is up to 1 billion people in the world suffering from mental health conditions, and there's an urgent need to actually start looking at better resources, better workforces, and alternatives to traditional mental health care that we can try and use to reach more people who are suffering.
Just finally, what are some simple techniques that people at home, perhaps they're watching, that they can employ to improve mental well-being?
Certainly. So a lot of it is about taking good care of ourselves. So it's about eating a healthy diet. It's about getting regular exercise, even if that means skipping rope in your lounge room. It also means trying to keep a routine. And we're strongly recommending too that you might like to reduce and limit screen time, reduce and limit alcohol or substance use. And if you're a person who has suffered with mental health conditions before, try as much as you can to maintain your treatment and your resources to access support. And if someone is feeling that they may be suffering a mental health condition for the first time, it's really important to seek assistance. And this means not just from professionals, but also keeping up with our regular social supports, our families, our friends, our colleagues. And that might be through telephone or Skype, Zoom, whatever way that we can. It might also mean reaching out to others, such as your neighbours, trying to maintain some kind of social connection, no matter how that happens. And these we know are probably the best protective factors that we can have for our own mental well-being.
Thank you very much for your time. We'll have to leave it there. Dr. Alison Schafer there, the Program Manager for the World Health Organization's Initiative for Mental Health.
Thank you, Kim.
Now, only 2-3 decades ago, Islamic finance was pretty unremarkable. A lot of deposit taking and lending to consumers. But as the industry copies many Western products, doubts have been raised about the credibility of some investments. with some going as far as to call them un-Islamic. Well, despite that and the pandemic, Islamic finance has grown at its fastest pace since the global financial crisis. Islamic finance assets rose 14% to $2.9 trillion in 2020. With almost 2 billion followers, the industry has huge potential. According to Refinitiv Islamic Finance, the industry is expected to grow to $3.7 trillion by 2024. Well, let's get into what's driving interest in Islamic finance with Umer Suleman, the head of the advisory board of Wahed UK, the most popular Islamic finance app in the United States. All right, thank you very much for joining us. So what is it that makes Wahed so popular in the US?
I would say it's not just the US, but actually globally now with our intent. I mean, this has made halal investing easy and accessible to the average person. Whether you want to go in with a small amount of investment, a nominal amount, i.e. $100, or you want to put in a larger amount, and allowing the type of access that were before unavailable to the average person. And knowing actually it's a company that has huge growth potential, innovative, values-based, and this is what set it apart from others.
For our viewers who may not be familiar with Islamic finance, you mentioned halal investing. Can you explain what you mean by that?
So essentially, halal investing means that we screen out impermissible activities from an Islamic perspective. So we can't invest in alcohol, pornography, gambling, as well as interest, which is forbidden. Most people are familiar with that if they're familiar with Islam, that anything to do with interest-based activities, so earning money from financial institutions, it is not allowed. So there's a green screen, and there's also like a positive screen, which we're going to see more and more of now, where we're looking at companies who are actually doing some sort of social benefit. They're not in debt. So these companies are well structured, they have good management, etc.
Okay, so it sounds like this is obviously investing on Islamic principles, but it also sounds like it would be a pretty good option for people who just want to make ethical investments. So why wouldn't I go for something like that?
You tell me. There's no reason at all why you wouldn't. Absolutely, it's ethical. These principles are actually from a sustainable investment perspective. We always say, look, take a long-term view. It's not about instant return. People today always looking at the quick buck, so to speak. But actually we say, look, take a more mature, measured approach, and you'll find that these principles completely align, that actually we have stewardship with the investments that we make. So that they're long-lasting, they're sustainable. So for the average person, they think, actually, I want to spend my money or invest my money in a more ethical way.
There has, of course, been some criticism, primarily that things like Islamic mortgages and car loans, that they're just too expensive. Why is that?
So you have to understand that the layers of Islamic compliancy require, there's additional layers of checking that need to go on, but they are becoming more and more competitive. I know Wahed, for example, is completely competitive in the pricing that it has with the open market. But car financing and home financing, this additional layer of compliance is what increases the cost. Also, access to liquidity. You're competing with a conventional system where there is excess liquidity in the market. And so it's not a level playing field, so to speak. But things are moving in the right direction. And now you'll find that the products are more and more competitive. Malaysia, for example, the Amana mortgage and the other mortgages that are available, which are halal, so to speak, they're competitively priced. And you find just as many people from a non-Muslim background taking them, as well as people from a Muslim background.
There are some products that have come in for criticism. I'm thinking of ETFs, exchange-traded funds, because they're not based on an asset like gold or property. And there's, the question of, does that make it speculative? Therefore, does that make it un-Islamic?
No, absolutely not. Just because they're not gold or property doesn't make it un-Islamic. Actually, if you look at exchange-traded funds, that there are underlying companies and products that are ultimately being invested in. These aren't derivatives or options. These are real companies. And actually, if you look at the spirit of Islam, it talks about money circulating in society, money benefiting society as a whole. Then investing in companies is the way to go, because these are companies that employ people. You're then able to support society in a bigger way. You're producing some sort of service or benefit to society, versus purely holding gold or properties as assets within yourself. You would consider that hoarding as part of a investment strategies, certainly we say have some gold or property, etc. But it's much more beneficial to invest in companies that provide this benefit and provide services and are actually employing people. You're benefiting so many more people, and it's much more aligned to the maqasid, or the principles of the spirit of the Sharia, so to speak.
All right, thank you so much for your time. We'll have to leave it there. Umer Suleman, the head of the advisory board for Wahed UK.
Thank you very much.
And that's our show for this week, but there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That will take you straight to our page, which has entire episodes for you to catch up on. And that is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Kim Vanel. From the whole team here, thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.